A quiet decision has been sitting behind their silence, and tonight it is closer to becoming words than it has ever been before. Not because someone convinced them. Not because circumstances suddenly became perfect. Something inside the person you love has simply reached the point where pretending they have nothing important to say feels harder than finally saying it. And this is where the story becomes different from what you may have imagined, because the message they are holding back is not one dramatic sentence waiting to explode into the open. It is a collection of thoughts they have carried privately, rehearsed silently, almost spoken, then pulled back at the final second. They have wondered how you would respond. They have wondered whether too much time has passed. They have wondered whether you would hear the meaning beneath their words or only remember the distance that came before them. But beneath every hesitation sits one simple realization they can no longer easily ignore: there are things between two people that do not disappear merely because nobody talks about them. Sometimes silence does not end a connection. Sometimes it exposes exactly how much remains unfinished. Don't skip. Because the most important part of what they want to tell you is not what you might expect. It is not simply, "I miss you." It goes deeper than missing someone. Missing can happen from habit. Missing can happen because a familiar presence is suddenly absent. What they have been confronting is more uncomfortable and more meaningful. They have begun recognizing what your presence actually represented in their life, and they did not fully understand its value while they were standing close enough to experience it every day. There were ordinary moments with you they barely noticed at the time, a conversation that lasted longer than planned, the way you understood what they meant before they finished explaining, the calm that existed when neither of you needed to impress the other. Those moments looked small then. From a distance, they look completely different. And somewhere inside that realization, a question appeared that they have not been able to dismiss: what if I misunderstood the person who was trying hardest to understand me? That question changed the direction of everything. Strangely, it was not one grand memory that brought them here. It was something almost insignificant. A familiar phrase. A place that reminded them of a conversation. A moment when they instinctively wanted to tell you something and remembered that they could not simply reach for you the way they once might have. For a few seconds, everything became still. And instead of pushing the feeling away, they allowed themselves to examine it. That was when they began separating what actually happened between you from everything they assumed had happened. There is an enormous difference between those two things, and they are only beginning to see it. They remembered moments when you became quieter, and they had interpreted your quietness as distance. Now they wonder whether you were simply tired of explaining feelings they should have noticed without needing another explanation. They remembered moments when you stepped back, and they thought you cared less. Now another possibility has entered their mind: perhaps you cared deeply enough to stop forcing something that needed to be freely chosen. That realization did not arrive dramatically. It settled slowly. But once it arrived, they could not easily return to the old version of the story. Suddenly, certain conversations sounded different in memory. Certain expressions on your face carried meanings they had missed. Even some of the disagreements between you no longer looked like evidence that you were wrong for each other. They looked like two people trying to protect themselves while secretly hoping the other person would understand. And now the person you love wants to tell you something about those moments, something they could not admit when emotions were closer to the surface. They want you to know that your words stayed with them much longer than they ever showed you. Some of the things you said were dismissed outwardly but remembered privately. Some of your kindness was accepted casually but understood much later. And perhaps most surprising of all, some of the moments when you thought they were not paying attention became the exact memories they returned to when nobody else was around. Then came the sentence they almost sent. They typed it once. Read it. Changed it. Read it again. For a moment, their finger hovered over the possibility of finally opening the conversation. But they stopped. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because suddenly the message seemed too small for everything they were trying to communicate. How do you compress months of reflection into a few lines? How do you tell someone, "I see things now that I could not see when you were standing right in front of me," without sounding as though you are simply trying to reopen an old door? How do you explain that the distance itself revealed something closeness had hidden? This is why they may appear uncertain. Their hesitation is not necessarily emptiness. Sometimes people hesitate precisely because the words matter. They know that once certain truths are spoken, the relationship cannot return to comfortable ambiguity. Something becomes real. Something has to be acknowledged. And they are standing near that edge now. Stay till the end, because there is another detail hidden inside their hesitation, and it changes the emotional meaning of everything. The person you love is not only wondering whether they should speak. They are wondering whether you would still believe them if they did. They know words cannot automatically repair misunderstanding. They know beautiful sentences mean little without consistency behind them. And that awareness has made them more careful. Perhaps, for the first time, they do not want to approach you merely with emotion. They want to approach you with clarity. There is something surprisingly mature about that shift. Instead of asking, "How can I make them feel something again?" the question slowly becoming louder is, "How can I finally be honest without expecting anything in return?" That is a completely different kind of conversation. But there is one truth they have not yet found the courage to place at the beginning of that conversation. It concerns the moment they realized you were no longer waiting in the same way. They noticed something subtle. Your energy around them seemed different. Maybe you stopped explaining yourself. Maybe you stopped trying to correct every misunderstanding. Maybe you simply became calmer. Whatever it was, they sensed that your life was beginning to move without asking their permission. And unexpectedly, this did not make them angry. It made them reflect. Because while someone is constantly reaching toward you, it can be easy to assume they always will. When they stop reaching, you finally see the space their effort had been filling. That space became impossible for the person you love to ignore. They began remembering how often you initiated understanding, how often you gave another conversation a chance, how often you looked beyond their guarded behavior and tried to understand what was underneath it. They may never have thanked you properly for that. In fact, this may be part of what they need to tell you. Not a dramatic confession. Not a promise about some perfect future. Something more believable: "I recognize what you gave now." For simple words in meaning, yet incredibly difficult for someone to admit when admitting them also means recognizing what they failed to appreciate. And there is another layer. They do not want you to think they are speaking only because they fear losing access to you. They have questioned themselves about that too. They have asked whether this is loneliness, nostalgia, pride, or genuine understanding. That private questioning has delayed them, but it has also made their eventual words more thoughtful. They do not want to return merely because the silence became uncomfortable. They want to know whether they can return differently. Something important is waiting for you, and it begins with a realization they have kept entirely to themselves. The person you love has been comparing two versions of you. The person they once assumed you were and the person your actions eventually revealed you to be. Those versions are not identical. Perhaps they once believed your sensitivity meant weakness, only to realize it required strength to care deeply without becoming careless. Perhaps they interpreted your boundaries as rejection, only to understand later that boundaries were how you protected something you considered meaningful. Perhaps they mistook your patience for endless availability. Now they understand patience has limits too. And the realization that seems to have affected them most is painfully simple: you were not asking them to become someone else. You were asking them to become clearer about who they already were. Think about that. Sometimes what frightens a person about genuine connection is not that another person demands too much, it is that genuine connection removes the places where they hide from themselves. You saw parts of them they had learned to keep behind humor, distance, busyness, confidence, or silence. You noticed when something was wrong even when they said everything was fine. You recognized changes in their voice. You remembered details they assumed nobody remembered. And being understood that deeply can feel beautiful and unsettling at the same time. They may have moved away from that feeling without understanding why. Now they are beginning to realize they were not necessarily moving away from you. They may have been moving away from the vulnerability that being truly known required. Here is where their private conversation with themselves became even more revealing. They asked one question they had avoided for a long time: if I could speak to them without defending myself, what would I actually say? The first answers were easy. I miss our conversations. I think about you. I wish certain things had happened differently. But those answers did not satisfy them. They kept going deeper. And eventually another sentence appeared: I wish I had told you what was happening inside me instead of expecting you to guess. That is closer to the message they are trying to deliver. They understand now that silence can make another person invent explanations, and those explanations are rarely gentle. When they withdrew without explaining, you may have wondered whether you mattered. When they became inconsistent, you may have questioned whether the connection had ever been as meaningful to them as it was to you. They want you to know that the story inside them was more complicated than their behavior made visible. Yet, and this matters, they are beginning to understand that an explanation is not an excuse. They cannot rewrite how their silence affected you simply by revealing what they were feeling. That recognition is important because it changes the purpose of the conversation they want to have. They are not preparing to convince you that you misunderstood everything. They are preparing to acknowledge that you were left with too little information to understand anything clearly at all. There is humility in that realization. And perhaps that is why this conversation has taken so long to reach the surface. Now imagine the moment they finally speak, not as a prediction, but as the possibility they keep rehearsing. They do not begin with some perfect declaration. They begin awkwardly. Maybe with your name. Maybe with, "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." Then a pause. Because the next sentence is the difficult one. They want to tell you that you mattered during the silence. You mattered during the confusion. You mattered even when their behavior failed to communicate it. But they also know you deserve more than being told you mattered after being left to wonder. So they are searching for a way to speak that does not place responsibility for their feelings onto you. That distinction is what makes this moment different. They do not simply want your attention back. They want a chance to be understood accurately. Whether that creates a new beginning, a peaceful understanding, or simply one honest conversation is something neither person can know beforehand. And strangely, they are becoming willing to accept that. This may be the biggest change inside them. Earlier, uncertainty made them avoid the conversation. Now they are realizing uncertainty is unavoidable. They cannot control your response. They cannot choose what you feel. They cannot demand that the connection become what they want it to become. All they can control is whether they finally speak with sincerity. That is why the title of this moment feels urgent. Not because you must rush, and not because some imaginary clock is counting down, but because courage is delicate. People can carry a truthful sentence for months and still lose the nerve to say it when the moment arrives. And yet, one particular memory keeps bringing their courage back. You probably would not guess which one. It was not necessarily your most romantic moment. It may not even have seemed important to you. It was a moment when you gave them space to be themselves without demanding performance. Maybe they admitted something imperfect and you did not judge them. Maybe they were unusually quiet and you simply stayed. Maybe you laughed together after a difficult conversation and, for a few minutes, everything felt uncomplicated. They remember the feeling more clearly than the details. Safety. That is what stayed. Not excitement alone. Not attraction alone. Safety. The rare feeling of being near someone without constantly editing yourself. They have encountered other conversations, other people, other distractions, but that particular feeling has proven difficult to reproduce. And this is where they discovered something they were not expecting. Sometimes the person who changes your understanding of connection is not the person who creates the loudest moments. It is the person whose presence makes the quiet moments feel full. They associate that feeling with you. They may never have said it. Perhaps they barely understood it themselves. But now it sits near the center of what they want to tell you. There is another reason they are afraid of changing their mind before speaking. Once they admit these things, they will have to let go of a version of themselves that felt safer, the version that could pretend nothing affected them deeply. That version allowed them to remain protected. If they missed you, they could call it nostalgia. If they thought about reaching out, they could tell themselves they were merely curious. If they remembered something you said, they could dismiss it as coincidence. But eventually too many small moments began pointing in the same direction. The connection had affected them. You had affected them. And acknowledging that does not mean promising forever. It simply means being truthful about what happened inside them. Don't skip this thought, because it may be the quiet center of the entire story. People sometimes delay important conversations not because they have nothing to say, but because saying it forces them to become accountable to their own feelings. Once spoken, the truth can no longer hide comfortably behind ambiguity. The person you love knows this. They know that telling you how much they have reflected may surprise you because their outward behavior may have suggested the opposite. And they are aware of the contradiction. That is why they want to explain, not to erase the past, but to finally place context around it. Then, unexpectedly, their focus shifted from what they wanted from you to what they wanted for you. This was the moment their thinking became less about possession and more about care. They began asking themselves whether contacting you would bring clarity or simply reopen confusion. They wondered whether their message would respect the peace you may have created. They questioned whether they were prepared to communicate consistently afterward rather than disappearing once the emotion of the moment passed. Those are not glamorous questions. They are responsible ones. And because they have started asking them, they are approaching the conversation more carefully than before. They know that saying, "I care," carries responsibility. They know that saying, "I want to talk," means being willing to listen too. They know that asking for honesty means offering honesty in return. Perhaps this is what they could not give earlier. Perhaps they had feelings but lacked the language, maturity, timing, or courage to hold those feelings properly. Now, little by little, they are learning that genuine connection is not built only on intensity. It is built on clarity, steadiness, respect, and the ability to remain present when a conversation becomes uncomfortable. And this is where you enter the story differently than before. You do not need to chase the message. You do not need to decode every silence. You do not need to imagine what they might say and build your future around possibilities. Your strength here is quieter. You can allow another person to reveal themselves through their actions and words while remaining grounded in your own life. If they speak, you can listen without abandoning your judgment. If they apologize, you can appreciate sincerity without pretending the past never happened. If they explain, you can understand their perspective without automatically accepting every interpretation. And if they tell you that they still care, you can receive that truth without believing you owe an immediate answer. That is what emotional clarity looks like. It creates room for both hearts without asking either person to disappear inside the other. The person you love may actually need to see this version of you, the version that can care without chasing, listen without surrendering discernment, and remain open without losing stability. Because there is something they are slowly understanding about you. Your heart was never asking for perfection. It was asking for honesty. A strange calm has now entered their thoughts. Earlier, they rehearsed the conversation trying to predict your reaction. Now they are rehearsing it trying to make sure their words are true. That difference may seem small, but it changes everything. They are no longer searching for the sentence most likely to produce the response they want. They are searching for the sentence that best reflects what they genuinely understand. And one sentence keeps returning. Not the dramatic one. Not the obvious one. Something softer. There was more I wanted to tell you than I knew how to say. Behind those words sits everything. The missed opportunities, the unfinished explanations, the moments they almost became vulnerable and then changed the subject, the times they hoped you could somehow understand what they themselves could barely name. They know now that you should never have been expected to read their mind. They know love, affection, or connection cannot survive indefinitely on hidden meanings. At some point, someone has to speak. And they are beginning to believe that person should be them. But there is still one piece missing. One specific truth they have not even rehearsed aloud yet. It concerns why they became distant at the exact moment the connection seemed to be becoming more meaningful. You may have assumed the distance meant their feelings were fading. Their private reflection has led them somewhere very different. The deeper the connection became, the more clearly they could see what it might require from them: consistency, vulnerability, honesty, and the willingness to be known beyond the surface. Those things sound simple until someone has spent years protecting themselves from precisely that kind of exposure. They did not necessarily know how to move closer without feeling that they were losing control. So they created space. And the space solved nothing. It merely gave them enough distance to see what they had been avoiding. This does not make every choice right. It does not turn confusion into romance. But it may explain why their behavior and their feelings seem to contradict each other. They were trying to manage something they did not yet understand. Now the person you love stands before a choice that looks small from the outside and enormous from within: remain silent and preserve the comfortable uncertainty, or speak and accept whatever truth comes afterward. For the first time, silence is beginning to feel heavier than honesty. They have opened the conversation in their mind countless times. They have imagined you being warm. They have imagined you being cautious. They have even imagined you saying that too much has changed. And strangely, considering all those possibilities has not erased their desire to speak. It has clarified it. Because perhaps the purpose of telling you is no longer to guarantee an outcome. Perhaps the purpose is simply to stop leaving something meaningful unfinished. Stay till the end of this thought, because this is where urgency becomes something softer than pressure. Sometimes a person does not change their mind because their feelings vanish. They change their mind because fear becomes louder than courage for one more day. And right now, the person you love appears to be standing in that narrow space between those two voices. There is a gift hidden inside this moment, but it may not be the gift you expected. The gift is not a guaranteed reunion. It is not a promise that everything will unfold perfectly. The gift is clarity. Whatever eventually happens, honest communication can free two people from stories they have been silently inventing about each other. Perhaps you will discover that certain assumptions were wrong. Perhaps they will discover how deeply their silence affected you. Perhaps both of you will finally understand why something meaningful became complicated when neither person intended it to. Clarity does not always restore the past, but it gives the future a cleaner place to begin. And that may be exactly what this person is preparing to offer you: not a perfect explanation, but a truthful one. Yet just when they thought they understood what they needed to say, another realization surfaced, one they had not prepared for at all. It came from remembering the last time they felt you truly pulling away. They suddenly understood that what frightened them was not simply the possibility of losing a relationship. It was the possibility that you might eventually become a beautiful memory instead of an active part of their life. That distinction stopped them. Because memories require nothing from us. Real relationships do. Memories cannot challenge us, ask us to communicate better, or expose where we still need to grow. A memory can remain perfect because it never changes. But a living connection requires courage. And the person you love has finally begun asking themselves whether they are ready to choose the living connection over the safer memory. Their answer is not fully formed yet. But something shifted when they asked the question. They reached again for the message they had almost sent. This time, they did not erase it immediately. They added another sentence. Then another. They stopped. Read everything from the beginning. And somewhere near the end, they wrote a line they had never allowed themselves to write before, a line that explains not merely what they feel about you, but what they finally understand about why they almost let something meaningful slip quietly away. They stared at that sentence longer than all the others. Because once you hear it, the silence between you may finally make sense. And that sentence is where the next part begins.